I'm Jeremy Baskus of the History Department, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker and to talk a little bit about the lecture tonight. On behalf of the History Department, I welcome you to this 30th talk of the Joseph and Edith Vogel lecture. As many of you know, in the mid-1980s, Ezra Vogel, who is here with us tonight, right there, with his hand up, endowed this lecture. Ezra is a native of Delaware and also a graduate of Ohio Wesleyan. He graduated in 1950 from Ohio Wesleyan, majoring in history? Not exactly, but we welcome him. In the 1980s, he generously donated funds to initiate this lecture in honor of his parents, Joseph and Edith Vogel, who were longtime residents of Delaware. They owned and ran the People's Store, which those of you who've lived in Delaware, I know many of you are Delaware residents from a long time, remember lovingly as an institution here in town. In honor of his parents, who were longtime residents, he established, Ezra did, this talk to encourage relations between town and gown, between city and the university. Ezra left Ohio Wesleyan back in 1950. He went on to have an illustrious career teaching in East Asian studies. Ultimately, he became the Henry Ford II Professor of the Social Sciences at Harvard University, had a long career at Harvard before retiring recently. His goal in establishing his lectureship, again, was to encourage the relations between the city of Delaware and the people, and to teach people about the history of Delaware. Again, we're fortunate to have Ezra here. A year ago, Dr. Vogel, Ezra Vogel, reaffirmed his love for Ohio Wesleyan University by very generously making a large donation to encourage student travel. In fact, we have a vibrant and exciting program in student travel learning, which was significantly helped with the funding of Dr. Vogel's donation. Ezra wrote a lengthy tome that has been widely translated into many languages, titled Deng Xiaoping and the Transformation of China. It's a 928-page book. I don't know if that includes footnotes, but it's 928 pages, and it is widely praised as a masterful new history of China's reform era. And translated in many languages, Ezra has very generously donated the royalties, I might be getting this slightly wrong, of the sales of the book in China, and at this point there have been sold, according to, as of this morning, I haven't heard it since this afternoon, 750,000 copies. This enormously this will aid students for many, many decades to travel the world and learn the history of many parts of the world. Tonight, though, tonight's speaker, in many ways captures perfectly this idea of town and gown. We have a gentleman who is both a native of Delaware and a graduate of Ohio Wesleyan, Tim Prindle. Tim received his BA several years ago in both history and geography. Indeed, the talk he will be giving tonight, whose title is there, was a paper that he originally wrote as an undergraduate here. Tim won many of the different awards that one can win here at Ohio Wesleyan, including, and I need to read them, there's so many, the Award for Expository Writing, the Anna H. Rusoff Memorial History Prize for the best paper in the Department of History, and the Robert E. Shanklin Distinguished Scholarly Award in Geography, among others. He is now, Tim is a graduate student at Bowling Green State University. He is writing a master's paper, which he will soon be finishing, on the streetcars of Cincinnati, the streetcar suburbs of Cincinnati. But that's not the title of his talk. The title of his talk, as you see, is The Whiskey War, Delaware, Ohio, 1874. Please join me in welcoming Tim Prindle.
Thank you, Professor Vasquez. I'm just so excited to be here in front of a hometown crowd here at my alma mater and see so many familiar faces. Some of those faces I have to thank. I hope you'll forgive me if I take just a second to do that. Especially like to thank Professor Vogel for starting this series. This is just a wonderful opportunity for me, and I'm very grateful for that. Also, Ohio Wesleyan and the History and Geography departments for really just making my time here so special. The librarians at Ohio Wesleyan for helping a great deal with this paper, as well as everyone at the Delaware County Historical Society for their interest in this and other research that I've done there. They've been enormously helpful. Also, she's not here, but Judith Olson, librarian at Northwestern University and caretaker of the Francis Willard House in Evanston, Illinois, was, I have to give her some praise, because if it weren't for her, this whole paper would be missing about a third of its interesting parts. I can explain later if you need to know. I'd also like to thank Professor Richard Smith, without whom this lecture would not have been nearly as interesting, because 4 years ago he agreed to have lunch with me and proceeded to blow my mind on the subject of Middle American history, and particularly the 1860s and 70s. So he put it on the tracks, and then Professor John Krieger was the one who helped me see it through into a paper and put up with some of my panic attacks along the way, so thank you for that. Finally, I have to thank my father, Dennis Prindle, who is not here tonight. He is actually out of the country, but he volunteered to help with this, and he actually tracked down a lot of the images that you'll see tonight in the presentation. He also made himself an expert on the subject along the way. I have to say, I think he might have a future in academia, so if you see him, let him know. So, now on to business. I think one of the more satisfying things about doing local history in your hometown is being able to see the past as something that's directly connected to places that you know very well. No doubt some of us have seen the plaque or something like it downtown that reads, "Frederick Douglass and William Tecumseh Sherman spoke here," and thought, major figures in our nation's history stood right here, where I am standing right now. It's a pretty thrilling way to connect to our past, and I think it's a good way to give us a sense of place in our lives. But there are parts of our history, local or otherwise, that are much harder to connect to from the vantage point of right now. Even in local history, if you go back far enough, I think you'll find that, as the saying goes, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And for me, the Whiskey War in Delaware was that kind of history at first. The streets and even some of the buildings were familiar, but the politics, culture, and major issues were not. 140 years ago, almost to the day, the women of the Whiskey War crossed culture and political boundaries to draw attention to the social and moral costs of alcohol. Those boundaries divided the city's neighborhoods, politics, newspapers, and especially the gender roles of the time, but they're long gone or unrecognizable now. So tonight we will look at the events of the Whiskey War, but also the ways that it interacted with old Delaware's divisions and what those divisions were, and maybe most importantly, what the women who crossed them on their way to, women who carried on their cause learned from the experience. So the Whiskey War is just one name for what is now usually called the Women's Temperance Crusade. The Crusades were an anti-alcohol movement that began in southwestern Ohio and spread like wildfire to 900 cities and towns across the U.S. and Canada in the spring of 1874. The signature image of the Crusades was respectable women taking to the city streets in what were called visitation bands. The bands marched to saloons and knelt inside or outside them, praying that saloon keepers and his customers would be moved to sign a pledge swearing to give up alcohol forever. It was a phenomenon, and the Crusades quickly made local and national news. The editors of Delaware's 3 newspapers, one for Democrats, Republicans, and one for independents, filled column after column with crusade news and editorials that tried to make sense of what was happening for their readers. Even Harper's Weekly and the New York Tribune sent reporters and artists to the most famous and dramatic crusades in Hillsborough, Xenia, Washington Courthouse, and Cincinnati, Ohio. The Crusades were so dramatic because they flew in the face of social norms that we don't think much about these days, partly because movements like the Crusade contributed to their demise. There are three important differences between the norms of 1874 and now for us to keep in mind, though, as we try to make sense of the Women's Crusade. First, in the public world of politics, commerce, and journalism, women were either entirely excluded or very much second-class citizens. They were decades from having the vote, and though they were often seen as nurturing figures like nurses or teachers, women were primarily revered as icons of the domestic sphere, the home and the family. Virtually everything beyond that sphere was the dominion of men, especially the smoke-filled rooms of party politics, secret societies, and the neighborhood saloon. Despite these restrictions, women had over time negotiated a prominent role in the temperance movement by embracing the two main stereotypes it was assigned by the men: passive models of domestic virtue, quietly maintaining a sober and godly home, or the victims of the violence and negligence of alcoholic husbands or fathers. By doing so, they accepted an unthreatening idea of womanhood, and in return, they gained the moral high ground on all domestic matters. The second thing to keep in mind, the type of temperance that women of 1874 crusaded for was not based in legal prohibition. Prohibition at the state level had been attempted, beginning with Maine in 1851, and the so-called Maine laws proved unenforceable where adopted and risked rioting in the streets. Total prohibition still had supporters in 1874, and in Delaware they had their own newspaper, but it remained a third rail for politicians. Temperance activists in 1874, like the Crusaders, clung to pre-Civil War temperance ideas. For them, alcohol was the devil's drink, a growing blight on society, destroying men who gave in to its temptations. Most importantly, they believed it was a moral problem that could not be solved with laws. So the last thing to remember is that alcohol was a much larger part of American life in 1874 than it is today. The United States was notorious for drunkenness in the early part of the century, and though the pre-Civil War temperance movement produced a measurable drop in alcohol sales and related social problems, post-war alcohol sales and consumption were on the rise again. Despite increased state licensing requirements, more saloons were opening all the time and profits from alcohol were soaring. Delaware had at least 33 saloons in 1874 for a population of 6,000. Circleville, Ohio had 85 saloons for 6,000 people. That's one for every 70 souls, including children, right? There was also more alcohol on hand than ever before, too. Production had almost doubled from 158 million gallons in 1866 to 298 million gallons in 1873. Most importantly, and impressively, annual per capita consumption grew from 4.4 gallons in 1866 to 7 gallons in 1873. If you consider that far more men than women drank alcohol in 1873, meaning that most of that 7 gallons per capita was consumed by no more than half the adult population, the size of the issue becomes clear. The average man drank 14 gallons a year, and that's not subtracting teetotalers. In comparison, our current per capita consumption, with much more assistance from women, hovers at around 2.3 gallons. So that's 7 times almost more drinking then than there was now. Any gains made by the temperance movement before the Civil War had obviously vanished by 1874, leaving temperance advocates like the Crusaders with a sense that the country was in a steep decline. Lax enforcement of existing alcohol laws was another worrying sign, and ever-increasing numbers of immigrants from European countries with little or no taboos against alcohol gave the movement a sense of pressing need and, in some cases, an anti-immigrant tone. Because the place of women in alcohol in society was more or less the same throughout what we now call the Midwest, the women's crusades in different places tended to work in similar ways, but they were all consciously modeled on events in Hillsborough, Ohio. A speech there on Christmas Eve, 1873, by Diocletian Lewis, or Dio for short, moved the women of Hillsborough to begin their crusade the very next day. Dio Lewis was a real 19th century character. He was a homeopathic doctor who claimed at one time to have developed a cure for tuberculosis, but he was also an early advocate for increased physical activity and looser clothing for women in that time of tight-laced corsets and cumbersome skirts. Most famously, however, he toured the country lecturing on his belief that women should take a larger role in a national temperance movement that he believed had been hobbled by the moral weakness of men. Lewis called women the fountainhead of social, moral, and religious influence, strong enough in soul to take us men in their arms and carry us to heaven. Beginning in 1870, he began giving a lecture that called for women to go to saloons and pray for their owners and occupants alike until they agreed to sign pledges of temperance. If his audience accepted the challenge, he would help organize their crusade. His lectures had sparked a few small crusades in places like Fredonia, New York, and Battle Creek, Michigan, but his ideas really found their mark in Hillsborough in the last days of 1873. Not long before speaking in Hillsborough, Lewis had accepted an invitation from two male students at Ohio Wesleyan University, Audie Byers and Willis Pine of the Chi Phi Greek Letter Society, to give a lecture on temperance on February 23, 1874. They had not asked for his speech on the role of women in the movement, but instead a general talk on the subject of temperance for the benefit of the existing male-led temperance society in Delaware. By the time he spoke, however, many obviously wondered if he would be organizing Delaware's crusade. A reporter for the New York Tribune who attended that lecture at the old Williams Opera House noted that the mood was cold at first, but then, as the Delaware Gazette put it, when the question was presented by Lewis, whether the public sentiment here was ripe for this onward movement of woman, the response in the affirmative was unexpectedly overwhelming. This vote immediately decided the character of the meeting as meaning business instead of the old worn-out machinery of the past, set speeches and men's rhetorical flights of eloquence. The women who would lead Delaware's crusade were appointed by some of the city's most prominent men, particularly the recently retired professor of Ohio Wesleyan, president of Ohio Wesleyan, Frederick Merrick, and his successor, L.D. McCabe. But the implication was clear. There was a new sheriff, or sheriffs, in town. The Temperance Crusades were in some ways the beginning of a transition. The old-fashioned temperance activism that usually cast women and children as passive victims of the evils of alcohol, as seen in this cartoon by Thomas Nast, where the woman is barely visible as the child begs her father to leave the bar of destruction. Coincidentally, Thomas Nast, on a speaking tour of Ohio, visited Delaware during the crusade, although he did not draw that while he was here. The new reinvigorated temperance movement that emerged from the crusade was driven by the concerns of women. The Crusades were able to reject what the Gazette's reporter called the old worn-out machinery of the past with little resistance. They put a new spin on two ideas that were central to that machinery: the approach to social change called moral suasion, and the belief that a woman's place was in the home protecting the family from moral corruption. Moral suasion, as practiced by pre-Civil War temperance movement, meant setting a convincing example of the moral benefits of sobriety, but it too often took the form of long rhetorical flights of eloquence delivered to the already temperate. Crusaders took their pleas directly to the doorstep of those they hoped to change. They sang their hymns and kneeled in prayer in the saloons if possible, or in snow, rain, and muddy streets outside the saloons if necessary. Doing so, they left behind their sanctioned place in the home and marched into the public sphere of men, local politics, and saloons. It was a potentially scandalous place to be. Normally, women would cross the street and go out of their way to avoid even walking past a saloon. But by confronting the greatest enemy of healthy and godly home in saloons, Crusaders maintained the kind of dignity and power implied in this slide, the March 7th cover of Harper's Illustrated, also by Thomas Nast. Their argument was strengthened by their religious convictions, and they were often portrayed in the press as an army of holy warriors, Joan of Arc style, filled with religious fervor. Poems even praised them for using military imagery. As the Delaware Gazette put it, "Those who have here stepped to the front ranks are from the wealthy, the educated, the cultivated, but better than all these, the consecrated of Delaware womanhood." One of these Delaware women was Harriet Callista McCabe, the wife of Lorenzo Dow McCabe, then the interim president of Ohio Wesleyan. On the first day of Delaware's crusade, she'd been appointed to accompany Dio Lewis to his next stop in Columbus for a meeting of temperance groups from around Ohio. That decision would prove much more important than anyone could have known at the time. It is probably impossible today to imagine just how surprising the sight of groups of women asserting themselves in public places was to people in 1874. This image was drawn for the popular Harper's Weekly magazine by the artist C.S. Reinhardt. He was a witness to the Women's Crusade in Xenia, Ohio, and drew what he considered to be its most important and dramatic events for the magazine. It's telling that he chose to draw this particular image. A band of well-dressed women marching 2 by 2 on a public sidewalk with no male chaperones in sight may seem fairly tame to us, but to Reinhardt it was striking, and to his editors it was publishable. Though there seemed to be no photos or illustrations of Delaware's crusade, I imagine the first sight of temperance women on the march down William Street was striking too. After spending Monday, February 23rd, the first full day of the crusade, organizing and planning, 130 of Delaware's crusades took to the street the next day in a single group, temperance pledges and Bibles in hand. The Delaware Signal, the town's prohibitionist party paper, reported that their procession filed out of the William Street Methodist Church, seen here, and headed down towards downtown, organized with, quote, gray-haired mothers to the front, singers in the middle, and younger women in the rear. Their first target were the pharmacies of Sandusky Street, known for selling alcoholic medicines. They filed into the first pharmacy, Hunter and Reynolds drugstore, until they filled the shop and the sidewalk out front. The owners immediately signed the temperance pledge, swearing not to sell or give away any alcohol except pure alcohol prescribed by a doctor. The women celebrated their victory by singing a hymn and then proceeded to Snodgrass and Sons. They had less luck there. The owner passed the buck, insisting that he would consider signing only if doctors would swear to only prescribe pure alcohol. Snodgrass didn't want to miss their business. The women left with a promise to return the next day. It was the first of many times the Crusaders would struggle to convince businessmen to walk away from the income that alcohol represented. The next two druggists, Starr and Cornell, were devout Methodists, and thus the women expected them to sign the pledge. They both refused. The women returned to the church to discuss whether a special physician's pledge should be written. Why did they visit pharmacies first and not saloons? They may have thought they would be easy victories. Pharmacies were the first target of the famous Hillsborough Crusade, where most signed pledges immediately. And the men of Delaware's Temperance Society had already identified pharmacists as a target before the crusade began. In any case, the first 4 days of Delaware's crusade were focused on pharmacists and doctors. Some doctors made a counteroffer, a pledge to offer only pure alcohol unless other forms were absolutely necessary, but the women politely refused. As they waited for a change of heart from pharmacists, they established a daily routine of prayer and action. The crusade was, after all, a deeply religious event, not far removed from the Methodist and Baptist tent revivals that had reawakened Protestant America in the early 19th century. Each day began with morning prayers led by women and men, as well as religious speeches from participants in other crusades. In the afternoon, small bands of 4 or 5 women would go out on crusade and return for more prayers and planning in the evening. The crusade was popular among Ohio Wesleyan students as well. In fact, during the first week of the crusade, as the women focused on pharmacies, the Temperance Pledge was circulated on campus and got the signature of nearly every student here. The Gazette reported that when it was discovered that some of the male students had not yet signed, the women of the Ohio Wesleyan Female College passed a resolution stating that they would not, quote, knowingly under any circumstances associate with any person not in league with the crusade or with the temperance movement. Soon after, all the men had signed the pledge. That one still works. Saturday, February the 28th was the first day of Saloon visitations. And I had to go back. There we go. The Delaware Crusade's biggest challenge was the saloon visitation. 5 bands of 4 women each visited 23 saloons, which seems to have been all the saloons on the west side of the river. According to the Delaware Herald, during the day, 23 liquor shops were visited. At most of them, they were respectfully received, at 1 or 2 places with harsh and abusive language. At one place, the door was closed against them, before which they stood a short time in silent prayer for the keeper and passed on. Several said they would close up if all the rest would. Others said they would quit selling if the ladies would buy them out. One said he was so troubled about it he could not sleep at night. Another said he saw no way to make a living if he should quit. None signed the dealer's pledge, but all the bands reported the outlook as truly hopeful. The most interesting stories from Delaware's crusade aren't about closing saloons. They're about a town coming to grips with the issues the crusade raised. And that's because the reasons given by the saloon keepers on that first day were more or less the same reasons they gave on the last day. Few seem to have signed the pledge, maybe 1 or 2, but as far as I can tell, none gave up the business for good. The longer the crusade continued, the less it was described in glowing terms. Its methods and goals were attacked and defended in newspaper editorials, letters to the editor, and in the streets. The Crusades were losing control of their image in the press, and as public perception was recovering from the shock of the crusade. Delaware's 3 newspapers, with their 3 distinct political agendas, provide virtually all we know today about the city's crusade. Luckily, they also provide not just the events, but how it was perceived. And from them, we get the perspective of native-born Republicans that dominated the west side of the city, the many immigrant Democrats on the less wealthy east side, and of prohibitionists scattered throughout. To read their early reporting, you might think they were all in agreement that the women were doing good work, even if they disagreed on whether it would be effective. By the end of March, however, their coverage was much more divided on the merits of the crusade. Because the crusade wasn't winning its signature fight against saloons, the real fight over alcohol issues had moved into the realm of newspaper editorials, local elections, and even the Ohio State House, places that were beyond the domestic realm of women and outside the goals of the crusade. That shift can tell us quite a bit about the boundaries the women were not able to successfully cross in Delaware's ethnic, political, and cultural landscapes. The 3 papers were rarely in agreement on politics and often openly attacked each other. The Gazette was the Republican paper, closely linked by class and politics to the leadership of the crusade. It was as close to the official mouthpiece of the Crusades as the Crusaders could hope to have. The Herald was the Democrats' paper. Its editor was skeptical of the crusade from the beginning, partly because the Herald was the voice of the East Side, where German and Irish Delawareans were keenly aware of decades of anti-immigrant undertones in the temperance movement. The Signal was a rare Prohibition Party newspaper that had published its first issue only a few months before. Focused mostly on the prohibition of alcohol, as well as some new ideas for social reform that would soon be adopted by the Populist Party, prohibitionists looked down on moral suasion as an outdated and failed idea. True believers in prohibition and moral suasion were not always in agreement, but they did have a common cause in opposing anti-temperance Democrats, as the crusade coverage in the Signal and the Gazette makes clear. The newspaper's editorial viewpoints are not always clear in the generally positive coverage of the early days of the crusade, but they are there. The day after the first bands of women visited 23 of Delaware's saloons, Crusaders held the first of several large Sunday temperance meetings on the railroad platform on the east side of town. Keen-eyed Delaware historians will know that that building was not there in 1874, but it's the best picture I could find. The Signal reported that a choir sang soul-stirring music to the 1,000 or so in attendance before prayers were led by several women and a speech was made by Reverend R.B. Pope. Many heard the truth at this place who would not have gone elsewhere to hear it, the Signal reported proudly. The Herald, reporting on its east side home turf, portrayed the same event as something more like a curiosity. Quote, "The singing and praying of the ladies attracted a large audience of those who were wandering about the vicinity in search of some means to pass the afternoon." The Crusades were certainly a spectacle to supporters and opponents, whether they were holding public meetings or out on their visitation rounds. This photo and the photos before, or many of the photos from before, are from Mount Vernon, one of the most photographed Crusades. And they show the curiosity the women inspired, at least in the Crusade's early days. The discussions and arguments among those watching the bands of women from inside saloons and on the street are probably echoed in the editorials that followed the first week of crusading. An editorial in the March 6th Herald praised the women, but criticized the crusade for not caring about what it called, quote, "the legality or justice of the undertaking," and forgetting that men are not willing to yield what they regard as a legitimate business on which they rely for a livelihood. The Signal responded on the issue of justice and the legitimacy of the liquor business, saying, "Some men have their all invested in this business, and when we go to them and ask them to give it up, we must be sure we are right. Reason teaches that in this demand, we are right, because no man has a right to sell alcoholic beverages. The trade is evil and only an unmitigated evil." The Gazette recorded an encounter between Crusaders and a Catholic saloon keeper on Winter Street named Gerber. He tells the women he has to consult with his priest. The Gazette reporter guessed that, quote, if he had a conscience, it was in an uneducated condition, and added that his God was gain, and it mattered not to him if in its mad worship he walked amid broken hearts and crushed lives. It's clear from editorialized coverage like this that the Gazette and the Signal were interested in the morality of selling alcohol, while the Herald was more concerned with whether morality should have power over the right to make a living within the bounds of the law. This image shows a German saloon keeper's wife in Xenia berating crusaders for trying to take away her family's only source of income. According to the reporter who was there along with the artist, she finally chased them out with a can of red pepper. I'm not really sure how that works, but it must have been some powerful pepper. As Delaware's crusade continued and some of its shock wore off, news coverage also shifted. Everything from juicy stories of defiant saloon keepers and their wives to editorials that tried to score political points began to appear. At the same time, old boundaries that seemed insignificant in the early enthusiasm of the crusade began to reappear, particularly the East-West political and cultural division. For example, the March 10th Signal published a story from a reporter following a band of 5 women making their rounds on the east side of town. They were locked out of the first 3 saloons and told to go home and take care of their own families at a 4th. As always, they prayed outside each saloon for some time before moving on. They then met a saloon keeper named Locke on the street, visibly drunk and quite dismissive of the crusade. He proposed that, quote, if the ladies would raise money to pay a debt he was owing, he would pour all his liquors in the street and give the ladies the key to the saloon until the 1st of April. 10 days away. After that meeting, they returned away from 2 more saloons, and the owner of a 3rd, a Mr. Doyle, said, quote, when 2 or 3 give up west of the river, he will also. Doyle's challenge to saloons on the west side cleverly made the issue one of East and West, Democrats and Republicans, and since the crusade was led by West Siders, he was virtually accusing the women of having failed on their home turf. The Signal reported on a visit to the home of Fred Antony, owner of a brewery that stood on the corner of Spring and Sandusky Streets, where the Ross Art Museum and former post office now stands. That visit ended with Antony's wife driving the women away with a cowbell and cries of auction, fools and hypocrites for sale here. That's the Antony Brewery, by the way. According to the Signal, after they left, Mrs. A's friends asked why she did not sell some of them, to which she replied, I couldn't get any bidders. The lack of saloon closures clearly hurt the Crusade's image and boosted the confidence of its opponents. Though Crusaders continued, the Gazette began to separate the Crusade from the saloon visits that defined its beginnings. Downplaying their importance as early as mid-March, the Gazette reasoned that these few saloons of Delaware have almost faded out of sight in the brightening glories of the coming of the Lord. These little objective points seem so small when compared to the upturning and overturning of public sentiment that has been going on so rapidly. Instead of saloon visits, the Gazette increasingly pointed to large numbers of personal pledges signed, including over 50 in one visit with the employees of the Delaware Chair Factory on March 18th, 140 years ago today. By April, it was apparent that without slowing the liquor trade in Delaware, the crusade had lost some of its appeal. And as people questioned its effectiveness, its early strengths became its weaknesses. Column space once devoted to praise for the pious women crusaders, if not their goals, began to fill with criticism. What had once been called visits became raids in the Herald, and praise for their mission was sometimes replaced for calls for the women to return to their, quote, maternal duties in their home sphere. The Crusade's prayers at saloons may have seemed noble in February, but by April they were called lawless for interrupting illegal business. Cincinnati even passed laws banning Crusaders from public sidewalks after complaints that their presence hurt profits and incited riots. Crusaders were called busybodies in other men's matters in the Herald and were accused of working for the Republican Party by the Signal. Despite the Crusade's attempt to remain apolitical, April elections shifted some focus to Republican candidates on a so-called temperance ticket that did well in Delaware, except on the east side, where, as if in response to the Crusade, a successful saloon keeper and Democrat named Curley was elected to city council. Clearly, public perception of the Crusaders had changed for the worse by May, but so had the Crusade, although not necessarily for the worse. In many places, including Mount Vernon, where these pictures are from, the Crusaders had taken to setting up camp outside saloons, sometimes in shelters they called tabernacles, after the portable sanctuary used by the Israelites after their time in Egypt. Increasingly, these tabernacles were not used as shelters for prayer, but as booths from which women would watch, writing down the names of saloon customers to be read out in church the following Sunday. Yeah, that particular tactic became quite notorious. This lonely surveillance of saloons and public places looked very different from the religious fervor and organizational momentum of the early days of the Crusades. And by the summer of 1874, the crusade was effectively over in the eyes of the public. It was, I think, a victim of its own methods. Dio Lewis was right to figure that the sight of women marching on saloons in defense of their homes would be powerful and effective. But he didn't plan on the many issues that might crop up when it wasn't effective. The crusade was perfectly designed to bring the concerns of temperance women into public places, but not to defend itself from negative public opinion. So that may be how the Whiskey War was lost, but Delaware has a small yet important role in the epilogue to this story, and I think that's worth a brief retelling as well. By the summer of 1874, Delaware's crusaders and crusaders across the nation were aware that things had gone wrong and were working hard to consolidate their gains as a temperance movement. When Harriet Callista McCabe accompanied Dio Lewis to Columbus the day after he inaugurated the Crusades in Delaware, she was made chairman of a committee to create a network of crusaders across Ohio. For that network, the Crusades were just a first step toward organizing women into a new force in the temperance movement. McCabe was a quiet but important organizational presence in the Delaware Crusade, leading only a few events. But sometime during the spring of 1874, she sat at a desk that can now be seen at the Delaware County Historical Society and drafted a constitution and bylaws for a state temperance union. That desk has been preserved because in June 1874, that constitution that she drafted became the constitution of the Ohio Women's Christian Temperance Union, and McCabe was elected its first president. Then, at a meeting in Cleveland in November 1874, the Ohio Constitution became the starting point for the constitution of the national WCTU. The WCTU went on to become arguably the most powerful temperance group in American history. In a way, it was born from the ashes of the Crusades. The successes and failures of crusades like Delaware's were certainly guideposts for its founders. The WCTU's longtime president, Frances Willard, acknowledged the lessons learned from the crusade when she said in 1875, "A phenomenon no less remarkable, though certainly much less remarked, has succeeded that wonderful uprising. Indeed, is aptly termed its sober second thought. That is the phenomenon of organization." So we see that the intoxicating days of the crusade were replaced by a sober focus on organization, and the WCTU organized like mad. It set aside saloon visitations of the crusade, but used the same motivation, the protection of families from the evils of alcohol, to bring their message to as many women as possible. Traveling lecturers spoke wherever they would be heard and organized WCTU chapters wherever interest was expressed. Their constitution specified that each local society should work for temperance in the ways they thought would be most effective for their area, which made their mission almost universally accessible. For example, in 1885, a woman named Mary Clement Leavitt went abroad to organize WCTU societies and returned in 1891 having organized 130 of them in 43 countries. The WCTU wasn't just flexible, it also developed into a powerful voice for women in the ongoing public discussion about alcohol. Frances Willard's motto was "do everything," and she made it the WCTU's motto too. The women of the WCTU published and edited their own newspaper, the Union Signal, with nearly 100,000 subscribers by 1890. And by historian Ruth Borden's count, the Women's Temperance Publishing Association published 2 children's magazines, a German-language newspaper, and an average of 12 books and 2 million leaflets per year, often handed out to immigrants in New York. Clearly, losing control of the Crusades' image in newspapers had an effect on the WCTU's priorities. In later years, they took their feminine defense of the home and into many other social issues as well, successfully gaining access to school boards, boards of health, and eventually the ballot box. Well, now I did it. Sorry. I already downloaded it. I apologize. Well, who needs it anyway? Let me start over. Okay. Harriet Callista McCabe, we're almost to the end, it's okay. Harriet Callista McCabe served as president of the Ohio WCTU for 5 years before stepping down. And I did it again. By all accounts, she was a shy person who never got used to being a public figure. She found more happiness working in her home, where Bashford Hall stands today, as the vice president of the Methodist Home Mission Association and editor of its publication, Woman's Home Missions. McCabe died in September 1919, just months before the 18th Amendment was ratified, and prohibition became law of the land. By that time, the WCTU had become an advocate for prohibition, though I don't know how McCabe felt about that. Harriet Callista McCabe is buried just down the road at Oak Grove Cemetery with her husband Lorenzo. The WCTU that she helped found is still around today, advocating for total abstinence from alcohol, tobacco, and illegal drugs through its printing division, the Signal Press. And that's my time. Thank you all for listening.
Questions? Actually, I want to start by saying, Tim, that was fabulous. That was absolutely wonderful. Questions for Tim, please. Mr. Prindle?
Anyone have a question? Yes.
What was pure alcohol the druggist was selling?
My guess, it's not explained in the newspapers, but my guess is, the question is, what was the pure alcohol that might be prescribed by doctors? My guess there is that it would be a tincture. Oftentimes herbs would be soaked in something close to pure alcohol to get their essence out, and then you would put it on your tongue or something. Yes?
This lecture helps to explain why in communion, the Methodists, the Baptists, and one of the group uses grape juice. The Lutherans, the Catholics, and the Episcopalians continue to use wine.
That does make sense.
And the organization of Welch's grape juice began by Methodists as a way to provide communion juice for the Methodists.
Okay.
How did they come to Welch's grape juice?
Well, that's my favorite fact for today. Huh. That makes sense. Yes?
So you pointed out the openly political affiliation of the newspapers.
Mm-hmm.
And the Democrat paper was East Side and more immigrant-oriented, and the Democratic Party would be opposed to social reform. The Republican Party would be. So in terms of the newspapers turning against the women, in terms of the Republican Party, it also turned against them?
Sort of. The question is, did the Republican Party also turn against women? And I think the sticking point there was that the Republican Party was naturally inclined to be a prohibition party, but on a national scale, they had no plank for prohibition or temperance or anything in there in 1874. Like I said, it was kind of a third rail for politicians. So what they had to do was be sort of moral cheerleaders, but not political assistance to the movement. That changed not very long at all after the Temperance Crusade. That would have been by 1880. Yes?
Regarding Carrie Nation and her involvement in prohibition, she made trips to, at least one trip here in Delaware. Do you have any information on any of that?
The question is Carrie Nation and her involvement with Delaware. I, like you, only know of one visit, and there is an interview with her in the Methodist archives here at Ohio Wesleyan from the transcript, actually, done by a student, which is fairly interesting. She came in, she's this chapter 2 of this that I just gave you chapter 1 of, a slightly more militant version, although she got her start in the same temperance movement as these women. But she really kind of rose to fame later, towards the end of the century, with a different brand of more aggressive temperance. Yeah, go ahead, Roger.
Did Delaware have a particular history in the rebirth of the temperance movement in the early 20th century?
I don't know too much about the early 20th century, but I do know that Central Ohio was always kind of ground zero for prohibition and anti-alcohol things. It was just such a strong Methodist presence here that, except in the cities, it was always a pretty popular issue. Back there? Yeah.
Discuss the aspect of the temperance movement towards the saloons and the druggists here in Delaware in 1874. Over the next 100
The question is there any shades of the temperance movement's relationship with pharmacies? Am I right? Or
More so if, let's say, saloons or
with saloons.
vendors of alcohol.
I don't know. I know that the WCTU is still active, and I know that there are people in this room who signed pledges in grade school and so on. I mean, they were a very real presence, particularly through the schools, well into the 20th century. But I really can't say if that there is an active sort of anti-bar contingent in Delaware. I expect there is in some informal way. Go ahead.
I have been potentially predictable, and I'm sure will be more question.
Okay.
Who starts using the word crusade?
Okay. Who starts using the word crusade? Is my understanding that Dio Lewis had something to do with that, but I can't guarantee it. The first reference I've heard of it is in one of his speeches. He began giving speeches in reference to temperance in the 1850s, so he had a lot of time to work up to it. I don't know if he coined it during that time or not. It was certainly meant to be a religious allusion, though. There was no question that it was a crusade. Yes?
So the question reminded me of, remember a few years ago at Judge's Gym, there was served alcohol, and that was like a huge thing.
Yeah, I think there's. Okay, sorry. The question is, do we remember just a few years ago there was a similar issue with people not wanting alcohol served on Sandusky Street in a beer garden for a music festival there. I don't know that that's connected to in any real way to the temperance movement, but I think in general people are always uncomfortable with the risk that can come with alcohol in public places. But I don't know that there's any sort of gendered aspect to it the way there was in 1874. Yes?
What's the relationship between the women in the WCTU and the eventual voting franchise rights for women?
Okay, the question is what's the relationship between the WCTU and later suffrage movement? And that's a really good question because the WCTU was initially not in favor of suffrage. Their version of womanhood relied on a kind of passive, politically weak kind of woman. She had to be the guardian of the home for their argument to work. That changed pretty quickly, but at first they were not pro-suffrage. But later, particularly with Frances Willard's guidance, they turned that into they turned the vote into an act of protecting the home and family. Just like invading a saloon, they invaded the ballot box. Yeah. Ohio never changed the state constitution to remove the word men until, what was it, 1923?
A national amendment.
National amendment. Oh, we didn't ratify. Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm learning things as fast as I can process them here. But
I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself. So, Ohio women are never successful in getting the Ohio Constitution changed despite serious efforts in the early 20th century, at which point temperance women, under Frances Willard, are also supporting the right to vote. And so just with African-American men in Ohio, it takes a national amendment to give women the right to vote. And then after women can vote in Ohio, they do change the state constitution to get rid of the offensive words white male. It's only successful after there's an alliance of African Americans and women, and then enough white men that it will pass. But it takes the national amendment to give women the right to vote in Ohio.
any other questions? Sure.
Actually, my question is actually more generally, before the dinner earlier, I heard some people talking about how when they were children here in Delaware, they were asked to make pledges for the temperance movement, and you did mention that. I would be kind of curious if some of you who have that memory can elucidate.
Is anyone here?
No, nobody wants to.
What was it?
I heard my brothers having this side, being asked to sign, and more so promise.
That's a good point.
I'm not, Jim, my memory is all that way, maybe Jackson or Candace have some better memories. But my memory is that they must have had some collusion with the teachers who let them come into the school at regular school time. And we were taking regular school time, and they talked about what a horrible evil it was. And then all the good students were supposed to sign a thing. And it really put the pressure on all of us to sign. Somehow it didn't seem to take very well.
Imagine that.
Did you sign Ezra?
Of course.
Yeah, that, sorry, go ahead. Okay, yes.
Well, someone was asking about the holdover effects in Delaware. We're from Westerville. We moved there just 16 years ago. Virtually every precinct was dry. That's not true at all today. But is the change in Delaware that recent? I mean, there were no restaurants in Westerville 15 years ago in the city proper to speak of because of the,
Yeah.
and it always seemed to me like it was connected to the connectivity.
Yeah, the question is, did Delaware's relationship with temperance last into the end of the 20th century? And no, Westerville has always prided itself on that dry aspect, but Delaware did actually go dry at least once that I know of in the late 19th century, but it didn't take. And I think they might have tried it again right before national prohibition. But as far as I know, after Prohibition ended, there's not been a dry part in maybe one of the townships, but not Delaware City. Yes?
Were women permitted to drink in the bars or?
That's a great question. Were women permitted to drink in bars and saloons? They were, but God help you if you went in. No one you knew would ever speak to you again. I mean, in big cities, though, honestly, yes, women drink in saloons all the time. So not all of them, certainly, but there was in a town like Delaware, that would have been extraordinarily uncommon, but there was no law against it. Yes.
Another question. Can you talk a little bit about geographically where these places, where these saloons were within
Sure.
Delaware?
The question is, where were the saloons in Delaware? And most of them, I'd say 2/3, were either on Sandusky Street or on one of the streets that cross it, Winter, William, and Central. And then the rest were right over by the railroad station on the east side of town, or on those arteries that connect the two. So basically Sandusky, Winter, William, and Central Avenue. Yes?
To what extent was this movement a Protestant, rural, small-town movement versus a more democratic, more recent immigrants coming into the big cities during industrialization? And there was a real split there because the Germans, Italians, and the Polish people weren't going to be teetotalers in the big cities. And therefore, to this day, there's a split between the big cities and the rural, small-town Protestant
Yeah.
communities.
Well, you've really hit the nail on the head. The question is, to what extent was it a urban-rural divide as well as other things? And I think that's really the heart of it. In places like Delaware, you had the Protestant majority feeling threatened by the arrival of these immigrants or their children, who were often Democrats, and so there's political tension, and then there's ethnic tension, and industrialization makes it all feel like it's going quite fast. So I would imagine that people didn't see temperance as a standalone issue, but as something that was connected to a lot of other things. Yes?
You mentioned the women in bars. There was a bar, same bar that's still there, on West William Street called the Weston Grill, that went by the nickname the Stag Bar back in its day. And the women were not allowed to go in the Stag Bar. Although we interviewed the lady in the restaurant next door who had that at one time and said, I always went in the Stag Bar when I needed something for the restaurant. And nobody ever tried to stop me, but she said I was the only one, I think.
Oh, good for her.
Actually, women's connection to temperance was a big problem in January. Because the Chamber of Commerce for that.
Oh, okay. I'm learning all kinds of things. The Chamber of Commerce went after temperance women who wanted the right to vote. Oh,
One of the reasons Ohio women are not able to get to temperance
I think it's great.
because the assumption would be that they would then be able to vote in temperance prohibition.
hook is here.
Thank you, Tim. That was a great talk, and thank you for everyone for coming, and enjoy your evening. I'm sure Tim will be happy to entertain direct questions afterwards if you want to come find him. But thank you for coming.